Welcome so much. We're so pleased to have you at the Women's Legacy Fund Contributors Luncheon. For those of you that are returning, you know what this luncheon looks like. This is a working lunch. I was thinking this morning of the analogy of kind of boarding a plane, you know? Just then I was the flight attendant trying to get all of you to take your seats. And I'll say now, fasten your seatbelts, right? Because we have a lot to cover. And I am really dedicated to landing this plane with a good decision at about 1:45.
So your first cause area, and your facilitators are going to be helping you walk through this portion, but your first cause area is access to resources for business ownership for women and girls.
So Tessa and I are going to just give you some reflections of things we heard, but it's always great for me to walk the room and hear things because it's also a chance for me to do some reframing and some myth busting, right? So one thing that I heard at a number of tables is, well, why are we only talking about women's business? Doesn't all business help? Of course, all business helps, but remember your frame is for the Women's Legacy Fund. You've made a contribution to help empower and educate women and girls. So we're definitely looking through this through a woman's frame, and we're using data from the women's study. So yes, I totally agree, all business is good for the region, but as philanthropists, you're making a decision about what you want to fund. The other thing is, we have got so many entrepreneurial business owners in this room. And I heard a number of comments like, well, I'm a self-starter, I did this myself, you know, what's the issue? Well, not everybody has the same resources as we do in this room. And this is why I love the data, right? Because the data takes away kind of our anecdotal experiences, right? Whether it's generational, whether it's socioeconomic, you know, there's so many different factors. So we're in a time period now where the equity, right, that Tessa described is different. And so this idea of what we're looking at is how do we, because data shows that this is a gap that we've got in our region, how do we promote, right, women to help them start businesses? If we think that's important. And that's the great part about being philanthropists. You get to decide, right? Nobody gets to decide for you if you think it's important. And if you don't vote for that or you don't put your money towards that. So I think that's really, really important. I heard some really interesting things walking around. This is a smart room. I think I even said at one table, wow, what a smart table. Because one of the first things that really struck me is you all immediately went to understanding kind of the collateral issues, like what about childcare? What about transportation? All of that kind of thing. And trust me, that's something that we work with the nonprofit who receives the grant to kind of figure out, like, let's be sure, right, that it isn't money just for the program, but what does this mean across the board for funding? So I really loved how I heard you all already beginning to think about that. What did you hear?
So I heard a lot about what it means to empower women and girls in a community and in a region. I heard a lot of talking about giving women courage to break out of doing what other people think that she should be doing or that they should be doing. And I think that that really speaks to this disparity when we look at the data for women compared to men. Right? So this courage and this creating a new norm of support for women as they are embarking on their business endeavors, a domino effect. So if we don't do this, are we at risk of going backwards as a society? And this idea that we've had a D+ in Florida, now that's across the board, since 2004, and what happens if we don't step up and do this? And I heard a lot of that talk, and I thought that that was a really interesting perspective of what the domino effect could be and what it means to give someone courage to try something different or that was maybe not expected of them. The other thing that I wanted to talk about, which is one of my favorite things to point out, is this idea of synergies. So that's my word. I didn't hear that word, but that's what I kept hearing a theme of. And I think that the Hendry County piece being #1 for women-owned businesses was a bit of a topic that people were really interested in. I heard it at multiple tables. We have to put that into the context of the synergies, all right? So I heard a table say that Hendry is #1 for women-owned businesses, but has one of the highest poverty levels. So what does that tell us? And I think that that's really important to point out, that as we're talking about what this means for the region, you can look at the whole sheet of data, right? Because it all plays together. There are synergistic impacts that happen when you push on one of those areas.
I also loved hearing on the personal side. I always love when you all are diving into question #1 about what does this mean for a woman. I heard, they become a role model in their family. Their kids see them starting something and being successful. I heard it builds confidence, self-esteem, independence. It gives women their own voice a lot of times when they're able to start their own business. And I also loved this when talking about greater change in the region, that more women-owned business had the potential to change men's attitudes about women in business. And I heard that at several tables. I also heard something that I hear from you all every year, and we've even adapted funding because of this. You all are, as a group, still focused on how early do you have to start this kind of thing, right? We always pick these cause areas and we think we're going to be talking about women starting businesses, but at tables I heard a lot about junior achievement. I even heard even earlier than that, like how do you begin giving examples to young girls and young kids? And I always am struck in this room that you all have the forethought to understand that you don't parachute in and solve a problem, that you can work on something, but you also have to work backwards to change attitudes. And I thought that was really interesting. I also love one table when one of the facilitators asked a question like, I think, do you think this would empower more women? And one person at the table said, well, of course it will, because it is this idea that if more women are in business earning a living wage, that's going to change their family and it's going to change the region. And so I thought that was really interesting. From a regional and long-term strategy, I heard a lot of you talking about increasing a family's economic status. Because starting a business, even though it's hard at the beginning, I heard the table in the back talk about, wow, it's a good thing we're looking at a long-term strategy because starting a business doesn't take 1 year. It takes longer than that. A lot of talk about when women are empowered, the girls and their families are lifted up by the examples. And then a lot of the opposite, too. You all were really in tune with many times when mothers and fathers are in poverty and aren't entrepreneurial, then the children don't have the example, right? They haven't seen that in action. And so I liked the way that you all were able to balance both sides. And I also really enjoyed listening how you were incorporating the data. Many of you were getting the sheets out, looking at the policy recommendations and that kind of thing, and I thought that was really fascinating.
One more bit, and that was about cultural differences. So if you did take a peek at this chart, you see that there are some definite disparities among race and ethnicity as well. And I heard a lot of talk about how culture could affect the success of a program like the success of a women-owned business-focused program. So I think that that's really, really important. We are a regional foundation. Your fund is potentially regional as well, and I think we have a lot of different scenarios going on throughout Southwest Florida.
And we are going to dive into the second cause area. Tessa, why don't you? Now this one's pretty near and dear to your heart because of all your work with Future Makers, but she's going to give you the data and some insights before you all begin your time together.
Okay. So, education. I saw a few of these buttons around the room. I know it's a lot of people's cause. And when we were talking about synergies, you know, what education can do for a community and for a family, it's pretty powerful thing, right? So the second cause area is related to higher education. We know that in Southwest Florida, fewer than 1 in 5 women, 25 or older, have a bachelor's degree or higher, compared to 26.7% in the state and 30.2% nationwide. So this is a cause area that has been near and dear to the Women's Legacy Fund's heart. Access and attainment to education opportunities for women and girls.
I'm really anxious to tell you some of what I heard, and I bet Tessa is as well. All right. I have to say, pretty much consistently, at one point or another when I was walking around, I heard how many people were surprised by the numbers, right? Just the low numbers of women in our region that hold degrees. And we're not even addressing certifications. You know, we kind of debated in the question if we should say higher education, but higher education really only means degrees, and so many opportunities in our region do come from certifications. That's another thing that I heard you all mention. A couple of tables were talking about kind of this match.com idea between what jobs are available and what education, you know, are required so somebody could get that job. I was also really inspired by your ability to make the connection between this topic and the last one, right? This whole idea of the type of education that women and girls are exposed to, right, could have direct impact on whether those women would be confident to start their own business. You know, this stuff is all interrelated, and it's why the topics have been so similar over the last few years, because we're starting to really zero in through data on what's really happening. I also heard a lot of, when the questions would be asked about, you know, would this impact the region positively? I heard a lot of course it would, of course it does, but a little different than in the women in business. People were making the tie-in between, well, we know this is important, but the numbers are still so low. And I think it's interesting because you do all talk about the programs you know about. I heard people talking about programs in the school district, programs at FSW, programs at FGCU. So where we sometimes all, as a group and individually, get perplexed is there's so much out there, but the numbers are so low. So what's the gap? And that's the other big thing that I took away from my listening time was you all were talking about the gaps, particularly as it pertained to scholarships. Because one table was saying, well, there's a lot of scholarship money out there. But then another table was saying, but the scholarship money isn't the end all, right? Somebody gets a scholarship but moves away and can't afford food or just doesn't understand culturally what it means to leave their neighborhood to go to school. And so it's all of these layers that impact the data. Again, no surprise, a lot of you started talking about starting early, you know, that this isn't going to get solved in the moment. A lot of mention of mentoring programs, a lot of examples that I heard. So thanks, vote, here we go, and I'll see you next year.